to see when it's live. Always takes a hot minute. All right, looks like we are live. With a slight echo. Okay, I've muted myself. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to IGDA Climate SIG, doing our bit. It has been a hot minute since we all last spoke. Today, or I guess take a step back, my name is Paula. I have been a previous co-host for doing our bit alongside Hugo Bile, Arnaud Fayol, Megan Carricker. And today we are joined by two wonderful humans. I'm so excited for all of us to engage with you. Andrew Brennan-Wald is one of our newest SIG crew community members. He joined recently. He's the founder of the very new Dream Beaver Studios, which is focused on commercial green games. He is joining me as our co-host facilitator today. And we are joined by Joost, who is, so I don't butcher this amazing resume recap. He is an associate professor of transformative imagination at Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. He also leads the Anticiplay project and the Games for Better Futures community, of which we've spoken about before. So excited to dig in. But is very much focused on helping open the game industry to new ways of imagining the future. So as you can tell, there's a lot of interesting climate conscious design content, collaboration experiences, shared trauma for us to go through. But Joost, warm welcome and long overdue. How are you doing?
Thanks, Paula. Really, really wonderful to be here. I'm a massive fan of your community, and I've really enjoyed listening to the podcast as well. I'm doing okay. It's been a busy day and of convening various conversations about the future of cities and imagination and anticipation with a bunch of political scientists. I'm just coming out of a session. Active but super inspiring chats all around.
That's awesome. Yeah, your name has been making the LinkedIn and Twitter rounds, and it's been really, really cool to see that scale. I guess like there's a lot of project work that we'll definitely be diving into. But I guess like first and foremost, would love to know more about what motivated you to join the climate movement. What brought you here in gaming or in general?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. I've been I guess a climate or environmental warrior type person since I was a very small child, doing things in elementary school for NGOs and organizing sort of activist stuff as a kid. Always wanted to be a biologist, which I became. So I'm an ecologist originally by training. I've just sort of like, I guess there was never really any alternative for me. I've just been, I would say I've been radicalized by Greenpeace in the early 90s because Greenpeace had a lot of they had a lot of money lying around that time, sort of I guess as a result of things like Chernobyl, years earlier and stuff like that. They were a pretty powerful and effective communicator, and I just grew up reading their activist books. They had this novel series which was all about their ships doing heroic things, and that's what I read as a child. So they have effectively, captured me as a person, and here I am. yeah, and then games. Yeah, also grew up with games, but I think, and with video games, mostly PC stuff. But I think the thing that made the biggest impression on me and just really changed my life, and that's the other part of it, was role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games. So especially Vampire the Masquerade,
Oh my gosh.
which I thought was really cool in high school, and I still think it's really cool actually. But like,
The
I
inner
was,
goth in me is so happy right now.
yeah, Vampire the Masquerade. So I had some friends who played that, and and I was gonna get invited to their group, and they told me stories about what they were doing and what was happening, and I was like, but how does that work as a game though? Because it's so free, right? You can just do everything, anything, and it's just the limits of your imagination. And I was just like, but I just couldn't picture what it would actually be like to play that game. And then, of course, I played it, and then I became a storyteller, as they call the dungeon master Vampire, and I've run lots of games, and I think it's sort of like high-wired my brain. I remember when I did a lot of DMing for Vampire that I just couldn't sleep sometimes because my brain was just like in in imagination overdrive, and it was all horror, you know. So, and then I realized, okay, shared imagination can be one of the most, like, just a few people around the table can be one of the most impactful things ever, just completely transformative. And I've just stuck with that, and that's how I ended up doing a PhD ultimately in sort of exactly in this, I would say, in sort of shared sense making and shared imagination and scenario building with people. I already started to do a bit of game stuff then. Then I spent a lot of time doing more sort of hard-hitting policy work with scenarios all around the world in something like 30 countries around the world on climate change policies and strategies using future scenarios. But that world is very um, yeah, it's sort of like rationalistic and technocratic, you know, as you can imagine, right? It's like, oh, we're simulating, we're doing foresight, we're simulating future scenarios, and especially when you work with policymakers, especially if they're trained in sort of a classic policymaking way, it's all command and control and sort of mitigating risks and stuff like that. And there was just fairly little. You had to really like work upstream to get any space for shared imagination there, which we did. But because of that sort of experience, I wanted to get back to games and just decided I'm going to take this sort of future shared imagination angle and complex systems, all this kind of stuff, move into the space of games. So I started doing that, more and more projects around that, but it was still mostly sort of the way that researchers engage with games. So it's like building little projects and little serious game initiatives and stuff like that. And it's so far removed from the sort of the activities of the game sector. So that sort of serious gaming, games for change kind of angle was my focus for the longest time, and then sort of drifted into with the current project that I'm in, much more into this space of, wow, I mean, the game industry is doing so much stuff. It's this massive imagination engine that's just out there. It would be crazy not to engage there. And I think there's also much more interest in actually being imaginative and creative and wild and crazy and dark and all these things that in a policy environment, yeah, I mean, you can do it, but it's a little harder. So that's me. Yeah.
I was going to say, I'm recognizing that this has a lot of similarities to how Andrew and I had our first conversation, which involved Warhammer 40K and sustainability, which typically do not necessarily align thematically.
Kind of oil and water, just a tad.
A little bit, quite. But it provides a meaningful critique, perhaps, or an interesting critical
It's a satirical framing. Maybe a cautionary tale or 10 is in there.
Perhaps, yeah, some dark comedy humor.
Just a few.
Yeah. But before we, I know that Andrew has questions that he also wants to ask you, but one quick thing, like, given our Doing Our Bit audience is interacting with you, Andrew, for the first time as well. Really quickly, like, what motivated you to also join the climate movement?
Oh man, the exact opposite of Joost. We're kind of sorry, Joost. I'm gonna butcher that. This is not the first time I'm gonna butcher that. I'm warning you now. I hope you're ready for this. I'm sure plenty of policy people in this space butchered your name in one way or another. So yeah, I'm just traditional gamer, golden path, born and raised by the wolves of the internet, playing Unreal Tournament lobbies. Firing up my dial-up modem and trying to account for rocket launcher lag and all that stuff. And my goals in life were to become the best there ever was in online arena shooters. And then got bored. Just got bored. I was like, you know what? I'll make my own games. This sounds fun. Let's make video games. Got in the gaming industry. Let's be clear. Climate was not on my radar at this time. I was in the bubble. I was in the bubble that didn't have to care, I was in a temperate part of the Pacific Northwest and the United States, and cradled in a valley of nature and protected from giving a crap about all of this world-ending stuff. I heard little bits of it here and there, unlike Joost, who's been smitten with things like Greenpeace for a long time. My first chat with Greenpeace was one of like, oh, are they terrorists? That was my introduction to that narrative. Was like, oh, there's a bunch of people causing a ruckus. They think the world's gonna end. Oh, doomers. What's this? So I was just really kind of in the game. My head was in the clouds of gaming, really. Um, but I spent once I got in the gaming industry, I started. That was my first experience with systemic issues. It wasn't environment, it was DEI. It was women in the workplace. I was raised by a single mother, so I never got the whole like she can't narrative. My first taste of that was in the gaming industry, and I was like, wait a second, systemic issues, what are these? So I did that for a long time, left the gaming industry, decided to gather hats elsewhere in traditional tech, that kind of thing. And then when I moved to the UK with my British partner, I was like, okay, now what? I really want to start this game studio thing I've been planning my whole adult life. What are we going to do? And I've become increasingly aware. Like now I'm plugged into climate. Now I'm like, oh boy, I'm closer to Europe and they care. um, so the States is a very different narrative environment for climate and how that's kind of grown up in people's lives. So yeah, I've been increasingly aware of it and was like, okay, can I melt these two things? So I long, just like you realized that gaming has this immense power over people, that there's such a mindset shifting engine in the gaming industry that's being so underutilized as a mindset engine, as a social engineering tool. When we ever think of social engineering in gaming, it's more about like the bad kinds of change. Like, can I get you addicted to gambling? Can I turn you into a mass murderer? Like, those kinds of things. That's the narrative around games and mental change. But if we use it for good, we can actually give people really positive experiences around the complex issues of like, okay, now what with saving the planet in a way that Attenborough can't do, in a way that a 30-second ad spot can't do. It's 5, you're going to hit skip ad. The bus stop ad that you look at while you're waiting in the cold, that's not going to tell you how to fix soil or clean your river or, talk to your congressman about, voting this way or that on energy. Like, games are able to deliver that complex message. So I'm here to crack the commercial code on it. How can you make damn good games that you don't need to sell on their climate angle? Have some of that climate vegetables in the bean and bacon soup, hand that to them and maybe something might change. But I'll actually segue into that. My problem, and this is a question I've got for you, Joost, is you really have to pick your problem. You really have to pick, what are you going to try and solve? What are you actually going to scratch? Because if you're just like, save the world, you're not. There's so many. It's like an interwoven tapestry. If you try to pull on the whole thing, you're going nowhere. You got to pick your thread and coordinate with other people that have picked their threads, and then maybe you can do something. It's a very collaborative thing. So my first game's about soil health. It's this extremely dialed in thing that's specifically teaching people, like, maybe the first year, if you were going to be an environmental scientist with a lean on like physical geology, that's it. Like, we're not trying to go wide. We're not trying to teach people how to do, this broad swath of environmental activism. It's very specific. And I think that's so important in this space. You got to pick your battle. You really got to decide what are you going to focus on and stay in that space and get real good at it. So for you, what's that? What are the problems you're really like, I'm lasered in on this?
Yeah, super nice question. I think that sort of specificity is really important. I think a lot about this notion of imaginaries, which is this very sort of like researcherly term, but it's this idea of sort of shared collective spaces of imagination. Like, what can we even think about, right? What is even available to us to think about? And I think that one of the best ways of actually extending and opening people's sort of possibility spaces and senses of what can happen is with these very specific things. So, I mean, the short answer is that right now I'm really focused. We're creating a game around climate court cases. So the Netherlands is a sort of global frontrunner with activist groups taking the government to court, taking Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, to court. And I've been part for a few months until things completely shifted of an activist group who who threatened to take one of the world's biggest pension funds to court, which is the Dutch pension fund for civil servants, which includes me as an academic, but also lots of different people. And this big pension fund is a big funder of fossil fuels, big in Shell, and this activist group has been for years sort of lobbying, pushing, etc., against ABP, the pension fund, to divest from fossil fuels. And then I saw that they were planning to organize a lawsuit. And then when I heard that, I was like, yes, because Shell, I know some people, I don't know. I know some people in Shell. I don't know if it's unfortunate. I guess it's okay that I know them, but I
It's
know
good to have context on the inside.
I guess it depends. Yeah, it depends on what that friendship is like, I guess.
Yes. I know some people who are in Shell or have been in Shell, and I have some insights, I suppose, in their thinking, which has sort of gives me a sense of that a fossil fuel company like that is going to fight tooth and nail against change, but their investors are different. They are not ideologically committed to fossil fuels like a Shell would be. They are interested in profits and return investments, whatever, right? And so the fact that there are major investors that are public pension funds, to me, was always an interesting target, because it's like you got to target these people, not maybe the company itself. And then because of the success of these earlier court cases against Shell itself and the government, I thought, okay, this is going to work. I am myself I'm a member of this pension. I can't help it. It's my pension fund because that's the university. I have legitimacy as a private citizen to be engaged with this. They are doing something which in the Netherlands has already been proven to work, and they're building on years of sort of work with this. So I got involved and did a few bits here and there for them, and then after a few months, ABP, even the lawsuit was announced, but even before it was officially announced, ABP just caved and they just said, okay, we'll take everything out of fossil fuels. So that's really awesome, a really unexpected success for the movement, and that was really cool. But in the meantime, one of the things that I had thought when I came to the first meeting that they'd organized, a live meeting where the energy was just amazing, and it really got me sort of invested and sort of interested in helping out. It was like, so what can game design do with a topic like this? And the first thing I thought about was Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, right? Because it's got that sort of plucky energy, dynamic, wild, crazy, fun, but it's about court cases. And I thought a game like that, but about climate court cases, where the goal is to inspire people to understand that they can be empowered, that the Davids can attack the Goliaths, and that would be cool. And then I was involved in one of the conversations there, which was about fundraising for the cause. And I was like, what if we make this a crowdfunding campaign, or at least a partly crowdfunded game, but half of the funding goes directly to these court cases. So then the game becomes a goal and a carrot, and it can have an impact without even existing yet. It's going to be built, and it's going to be a reward for people who are supporting this campaign. And I think we're in the process of developing sort of we're recruiting an artist, we're recruiting a story writer, narrative writer, and these kinds of things. And then the crowdfunding campaign will be launched in the near future. But what I'm incredibly fascinated by as sort of an activist, designer, researcher, whatever, is this kind of work where you look at game development and the game sector and everything as an entire process, and you think, what are the possibilities there for change? Not just to make a game that educates people on a subject or that inspires them, but to think about what is the game as a symbol and as a entity in the culture, even if it doesn't exist yet, able to do. And what does the process of getting that together, what does it mean for people to understand that we're building a really weird, wacky, wild game about this subject, which at the same time is very playful and sort of just playful, and at the same time is incredibly serious and really taking on power structures head on. And that, that adds to me this sort of really deep desire to collapse seriousness and playfulness. I think we can be super playful and play with all of our assumptions and all of our sort of things, and that is not contradictory to being incredibly serious about what's going on. I don't think it's a line. I think it's a circle. I think zombie life is in the middle there, neither being really playful nor being deeply serious about what's actually happening. That's most people's sort of standard mode, and we can move towards deep seriousness about what is actually happening and about how horrible things are, as well as becoming more deeply playful. So that's my example of my slice, I suppose. But okay, maybe I should stop there. That's
well, I mean, there's just a couple things I wanted to kind of ask on the heels of that, or just kind of like aggressively agree with you on, is that first, that game doesn't even have to exist yet to spark that communal creativity and wonder and imagination. Look at Star Citizen. All that had to happen was some guy who made a similar game back in the day said, hey, I want to make a new playground for you people who like escaping into this hyper realistic star simulation, this space opera simulator, let's call it that. And the game's still not done. It wasn't playable for years, but people were just funneling so much, not just money, but passion and intrigue and desire and like, oh, what if this, what if that, look at what it could be, and just carving up huge chunks of their life over hyping this game. Similar things happened to Cyberpunk. The potential for vaporware in the gaming industry is high, but in the same way, the potential for shared expression of innovate of like, what do you want to see? What kind of worlds do you want to imagine and experiences do you want to share? It happens well before a line of code is written. Like as soon as you've got a prompt out there, people jump on it because they start telling stories.
Exactly.
We are wired for story, and if you create a space for someone to make a story for themselves, especially an anticipatory one, like, oh, I'm gonna get to blank, they'll fill it. So I'm with you on that. And then additionally, that shared space of being not just serious but playful. I mean, Spec Ops: The Line existed.
Yes.
This War of Mine existed, and those give you dopamine and sad chemicals at the same time. It's not just, oh, we're gonna give you depression and joy in equal measure. It's like, I had fun around a deeply serious thing that I'm gonna go think about now. I'm gonna put the controller down and think. Even like choices later on in Mass Effect or stuff, you gotta put that controller down for a second. Oh man, what am I gonna do?
Well, that self-reflection process is so interesting to me because so I started out for my context, I started out in commercial, burnt out really hard, went into nonprofit gaming education, and went back to commercial and now in publishing, with the intent to help facilitate easier processes for game developers to get to market and get the hopefully huge reach, right, and commercial success. While also through the Climate SIG community, building opportunities for all of us to share knowledge. And there's this huge tension about what fun means in the context of defining and making an impact. And one of the reasons why I'm very interested in how your game evolves and manifests and grows over time is because one of the things that the Obama administration had done in 2014 was host the one and only White House Game Jam, with the intent to engage young pre-voting audiences in understanding the voting system and the complexities of the Electoral College. It was hilarious because a lot of game developers at the White House going what's happening was a fun experience. But the other thing that was fun and also kind of sad, to be honest, because I think we in the impact space and commercial spaces, this was still painfully new, and it's still painfully new in many ways. But the main lesson that the majority of the students who ended up playtesting the Game Jam prototypes, the main thing they consistently came away with, which was good and terrible, is wow, the Electoral College system is really hard and it's really just about money. Which is it's true. And it's painful. And
be careful what you want them to realize.
Right. And what do you do? What do you then do with that information? And I think that's something that the quick connections and actions that you've mapped to potential policy outcomes is really exciting, because in the commercial space right now, a lot of what we define as a climate action or a green activation through games is almost always tied to like reforestation projects and earned revenue, and policy is something that's not something that we talk enough about, because there's a lot of tension, especially when you talk about major companies. But that's something that's I'm really excited about, and this kind of dovetails into the next question about what you are doing with Anticiplay and the research that you have funded through the Dutch National Research Council. Like, I just remember one of my like favorite first experiences with you and your team was in gathertown.io, where you had done a digital convening and there was a digital stage with like, 8 or 16-bit characters, and we got to hear each other talk, and think about like the future with like a hopeful lens instead of like the demoralizing, soul crushing lens that like I think we've all been trying not to do the past couple of years. And I took a lot of inspiration and hope from that and felt a strong sense of community. And so how has that project been so far, and what lessons have you continued to take on as your project is growing?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I'm so happy about that experience. It was so fun and so cool to be together, and just these sort of like simple things like gather time can just be really, I don't know.
I also just that was my first time meeting you as well.
Yeah.
It was the complete opposite theme, which is like, how do we get people to like meld destruction with all this stuff? Like, how do we get to use the classic gameplay loop of like break shit to invigorate change and reconsidering things, and like see unjust systems through the lens of, I guess, creative destruction or proactive destruction or just pro-social destruction, which is what you'd want to call a protest, right? So it's like, what's the video game version of that? So, and again, in Gathertown, in this kind of like this really great curated space, it felt like a game itself. It was just like, yeah, you know how to create a space. It's really good.
Yeah, I've got an amazing team doing that. Really cool people, and the vibe in our team is just great. We once joked that our internal vibe is so good. It's like, submit to our vibe or fuck off. It's just anyway.
I mean, that's why you fit in really well with the Climate SIG.
Yeah. So basically, I think what we're bringing that might be a little bit different in this sort of climate space is best explained by I was just reminded of this yesterday. I was at a thing about music and sustainability, where I'm also a metal singer in a metal band, and I was talking as a researcher and a metal singer.
I forget that, and I get really excited every time I remember.
Thanks. And anyway, yesterday there was a techno producer there who's also a researcher, a guy called Steve Williams, who is connected to University of British Columbia, now lives in Berlin. But he talked about the work by a researcher called David Maggs, who talks about 3 types of engagement with sustainability in the arts and creative sector. Mode 1 is making it sustainable. This is sort of like the footprint of the sector. Mode 2 is communicating at audiences about specific sustainability problems. But mode 3 is different. So mode 3, and that's where we are with Anticiplay and the Games for Better Futures community. It is more like, how can we together open spaces of imagination for new things to emerge, for new ideas about the future to sort of emerge out of collaborative engagement like that. So we think that coming from the sort of future scenarios, future thinking sort of space, we think that what we have to offer that maybe other people aren't doing as much of is, rather than saying, this is the issue, do this, learn this from our game or whatever, it is to say, how can games be how can the game sector essentially become an infrastructure for imagining? So or an engine, but imagination infrastructuring is a term used by sort of activists working in creative practice. And this notion of just how can we think about games as these spaces that just inspire new ways of thinking about the world and about action? And that's one, I think. So imagination infrastructuring, opening up shared spaces for imagination. I think, for instance, One thing I just think is that if we would be able to just get kids in high schools playing tabletop role-playing games everywhere around the world, it doesn't even have to be about anything. I mean, maybe you want it to be a bit deep and a bit reflective or whatever, but look at me, I'm like a product of Vampire the Masquerade, and I was never really meant to be about, anything serious in that sense, but here I am. I've just been blown away by the power of collective imagination. It gave me lots of agency, and here I am doing this stuff. So that sort of like raw imaginative power and empowerment and recognizing people's imaginative power. And then the second thing I think that we're maybe exploring specifically is breaking down the boundaries between games and real action. So the example of the climate court case game, which doesn't exist yet, and yet is going to be hopefully a sort of like a way to mobilize people and collect funds, etc., around these climate court cases. I've mentioned in blogs and stuff, and also in that event, Andrew, that you mentioned, the protest movement in Hong Kong, which is really interesting in the way that they have used games to mobilize themselves and use game language and build new games and stuff. But it doesn't only have to be about protest. So, for instance, I have been involved in a game that we've built for originally for Utrecht University, but it's now being played in universities across Europe and hopefully beyond, outside of the university space, which is essentially it's a mobile game where you're just walking around with a group of people in your city, and you're just reimagining the environments that you live in terms of the future. So the game doesn't really offer that much scaffolding other than sort of people sharing their ideas with each other and having that sort of social media kind of social component. But it's just a game that's about seeing your environments in a new way and what that does. And then the entire game, the entire world becomes your playground for reimagining your future. And then we measure, right? Do people feel more like they have an action perspective that they didn't have before? And the answer is typically yes. So that sort of blending of game and non-game action, trying to create more or help contribute to more imaginative societies in general. And that mode 3 approach of hitting something deeper in people's, I think empowering people in terms of their imagination would be a bit of a different goal. So on the one hand, we do that through these very specific projects like the climate court case game, but on the other hand, I think there's something very deep that can also be a slice, it's like a slice of the root, and that's really exciting. I think that's probably what we're contributing, and for that, what we're doing, where many game researchers, I think, at least in the sustainability space, look at games for change, look at serious games and these kinds of things. We are very interested in looking at what do the best games in the industry actually do in terms of raw, imaginative activation and. For instance, one of our team members, Karine Moosdorf, has a background in LARP, and she studied with a sort of cultural sociology lens a LARP just as a sort of holy grail of just bottom-up, total imaginative collaboration, right? And we're just looking at that and seeing what is happening there that we could do in a space that's connected to sustainability. We're looking at Bloodborne, like Disco Elysium, like these kinds of games that there's something about Bloodborne, for instance, that is just like hallucinatory. This is a game that does not feel like a game; it feels like a trip, a very dark trip. But it has all kinds of complex stuff around institutional power in there, and it turns the racism of Lovecraft on its head and makes it very different. And it's just intensely, sort of imaginatively powerful as hell. And that raw power. People always approach me, and because they know I work on games, and they're like, "Hey, Joost, we have a boring sustainability thing. Can we talk about how to gamify this?" And I'm always like, no, we got to make actual games, games that just absorb people and just inspire them, and not gamify some boring shit,
How much sugar do I need to pour on my broccoli?
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
It's the other way
And
around,
also
like
how much,
yeah. Because so often I think making these games it is an active restraint if you want to have commercial success. You can't get on a megaphone and say, "We're making a game about climate. Come on down. Come buy this." Because the people that are going to buy the game about climate are already converted. Like that's the choir.
Yes.
So you don't need their sales. I mean, you want their sales. They're going to buy your game anyway. Count on that. But, I mean, what do you think about trying to reach the unconverted? We have a tendency, especially in serious gaming for good, edutainment, whatever you want to call it, of hardcore preaching to the choir, getting so excited about our own impact that we end up only talking about that and forgetting to make a good game.
Yeah. Sorry, Paula, you want to go first?
Oh no, I was just gonna say, well now it's completely gone. Never mind.
Sorry.
No, ignore it. Like I think it's like combined excitement for the topic. So keep going, and if it comes back, it comes back.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. So I think my pitch would be, and I think this is one way to do it. I do think there's a really good place for sort of games that talk really about more concrete issues. I would say that I would be interested in games that empower people, that show the complexity of sort of caring for each other, that give people an opportunity, the players an opportunity to humanize themselves, to discover their own empathy, to discover their power and their imagination. And I think that then you don't have to convince them of anything. You just make them better people, and then they can do whatever they want, and maybe they'll turn into, maybe they'll take it into the wrong space, who knows, but you don't have control over that. That's fine. But I think that's really interesting. And actually, when I think about Bloodborne, Bloodborne was never sold as a Lovecraftian game, right? It was sold as a gothic horror game, and they kept the Lovecraftianness really hidden, which is just amazing. And what if we could do that with sort of like, oh, you're playing just a fun game, but actually you're going to be confronted with all these deep questions about yourself, and you're going to come out as an agent of change, much like a Lovecraftian, horror works in Bloodborne kind of thing. I think that would be quite interesting. I think that, the perennial example, I guess, right now for me is always Disco Elysium, because Disco Elysium talks about politics very concretely. It talks about, it has an analog for climate change and existential threats and stuff, and ecology and everything, and more than human perspectives with the phasmid, but it doesn't try to convince you of anything. It's a reflection and a meditation on how economic systems interact with relationships, with ideology, with everything. And I think playing Disco Elysium, okay, this is also maybe a game for the converted, right? It's an acquired taste, but for many people, like many people play Disco Elysium, it's a game that makes you more human, I think, and more richly human. So it
exposes you to the more full spectrum side of humanity. So many games carve off this little slice of the pie of humanity that they really want you to pay attention to, and I think Disco did a great job of putting more full spectrum humans on the screen. And those are the RPGs that really stick with us if you think about it. People played Disco Elysium because it was a fantastic CRPG.
Yes.
And then there were some of the converted that were like, oh yeah, let's talk about communism and Marxism, and with my stat sheet and all that. And that's fantastic. But yeah, I guess I'm just aggressively agreeing with you. Again, these things they almost hit harder when they're subtle. They hit harder when you're not expecting it to, because then you put your armor up. If I tell you my game is going to try and change your mind on climate, if you're not already converted, you're putting armor on. You're crossing arms. If I'm going to make a game going to teach you about salmon, you're going to come in with all your preconceived notions about what you think that is. And you're not as teachable.
And I react the same to these games. I have a lot of resistance to games who try to teach me something, especially because it's already my work. So I'm like, oh no.
I was going to say, it's part of the day job already. You're probably like, oh, I just want to escape.
Yes, and I think that I think that we have to ask ourselves, what do we really want to teach people? And I think it's deeper things like a sense of entanglement with the world, that we are ecologically entangled. You can explain that in many ways, let people experience that in many ways. Empowerment and a sense of agency and a reflexivity about their own ideological commitments and assumptions. Show people the blind spots that they have regarding the reality of others. All these things. That's the deep level, that is. And I think the closer you keep game experiences, narratives, worlds, whatever, to people's own identities and their own sense of self and their own concerns, the more enraptured they will be with the experience.
That's
Yeah.
something that I'm so curious about, like diving into with both of you today, because I think, well, I mean, to definitely stress the point that if it feels too forced, or it feels too intentional, or it feels so mechanical as an expectation, like most players who want a sense of escapism, like will indeed be very hesitant for it, unless like they already are actively seeking those out. And I'm curious, with the next question being like, how do we break out of our, I'm trying to figure out a way to say this delicately, I guess I just won't, like, as a commercial gaming industry, I think that we have a lot of historical biases about what successful games look like. And if it's games that make us feel too much, that makes us think too much, unless it's specifically designed for that core audience. There's like a hesitancy to it. Like we see this a lot in Western media, where a very vocal minority of people will try to, review bomb a game or a movie or a book because it is too woke, quote unquote. When the reality is, like, it just provides more perspectives and additional representations of the people around us, and additional stories that historically may not have been as popularly advocated for. And so as especially as our industry grows, and more, younger developers, younger players who will eventually be paying all of our bills, will be making decisions about the types of content they want to buy, and what they see in themselves, and how that's represented, and how our values are represented in the games that we play. There's I think that minority of folks who are very hesitant to that change are like, if they're not already, they're going to be dealing with that reckoning, right? Like that cultural shift. And so do you have, like, there's multiple ways I kind of want to ask this question, but how are you thinking about approaching those players and those developers who have not given themselves permission yet to imagine a world in which, like, the dominant hyper masculine competitive mindset doesn't have to be the norm? How do you break them free into a more collective versus individualist mindset? I know that's like a big existential question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think developers and players, it would be a slightly different question in that sense, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, how to approach them. I think I would say it's really about together creating examples that are really hard hitting, that just are just amazing and just clearly so convincing that this is possible. And I think, a Disco Elysium is an example. I think something like a Wolfenstein, the new Wolfenstein games that play with sort of the need for rebellious action, clear anti-fascism, but lightness and playfulness there. Lots of the new Colossus has interesting discussions about patriotism versus anarchism. There's a
That is a good example. Yeah.
about that, and sort of and racism, all these things, and structural racism is in that game, and it's really interesting, and it's fun, and it's ridiculous, and I think that if we can, rather than sort of convincing people broadly about this, I think we need enough really amazing examples that people just grow up with and that open people's minds. Yeah, just make amazing games, and I guess the more we have these games that are just incredible and clearly popular. I mean, the example of sort of like the hesitancy with certain things around something like that's something like Elden Ring as a big commercial success sort of counteracts a little bit. Of course, Elden Ring, yeah, it's an interesting combination of a really path-breaking game, but also following a lot of sort of mainstream trends, I suppose. But doing that in a way that maybe people didn't expect to be that successful. I think a whole spectrum from Elden Ring towards, Disco Elysium, Citizen Sleeper, and then towards the smallest itch games that do something completely crazy. I think that's we just need really amazing games. And then of course it's a question about approaching developers around this stuff and giving people the confidence that it's possible. which is a loop, and it has to do also with so it has to do also with games journalism, I think, and how people speak about these things and whether they recognize it. It has to do with education and what role, I would love for there to be classes in high school that are game studies classes where our kids are all playing games, right? And then how do you teach them to be more literate about their own experiences and more reflective about their own experiences? Yeah, there's so much to talk about. So I am also involved in teaching at the Utrecht University of the Arts, which is one of the best game development schools, I guess, in Europe, I would say. And lots of their students go to big studios and start successful indies. And there this is what we do for a few months with them, And so then before they even become professional game developers, they are exposed to a very new way of thinking about game development. And it's about opening sort of imaginative spaces. Yeah. I can say so much more about this, but yeah.
Yeah, it's really like you could put a whole 2-hour podcast together about the nuance of how do you hide the vegetables in the soup that we're trying to offer people. How do you, tell people without telling people, I'm going to try and change your mind right now, And the analogy I've been using a lot as we're developing our game is that, and it's apt because it's about soil health, is that I don't sell people ideologies. And I'll make this analogous to a tree versus a seed. I'm not selling you a tree because I grew that tree. It's my tree. You can have it. You can adopt it. You merely adopted the tree. I grew it. So I give people seeds and I make them aware of watering cans. Because so much of behavior change is agency and ownership.
Yes.
Inception explored this fantastically in a very fantastical way, of course, but we needed that analogy to say, hey, Inception was a D&D campaign about changing someone's mind. That's what that movie was. It was a D&D campaign about changing somebody's mind. And the loops you had to jump through, the depths of fantasy and ownership switcheroo you had to pull to change someone else's mind to something you wanted. That is the depth you'll have to go to, literally dreams within dreams. So
many failed deception checks. Sorry, keep going.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Like the dice rolls didn't roll in their favor a lot of times. But this is the thing: is that if you start with selling someone a tree, you've lost. You've already lost. Campaign's over. You're not doing it because it's never theirs. They'll never make that tree theirs. They always knew from a sapling it was somebody else's. It's like, adopting a dog. It's nice, but man, not having those puppy years, you miss something. So we give gamers the puppy years. We approach it as like, I'm going to give you a seed. I'm going to teach you how to take care of it a little bit, but I'm not going to take your agency away. I'm not going to take your ownership away, because if I had to force you to grow that tree, you were never going to hold on to the tree I would have sold you anyway. That would have been a loss. That person never would have crossed that bridge anyway. So this is the act of restraint. This is the restraint I'm talking about when we're trying to do. I don't actually believe, here's my hottest hot take, I do not believe behavior change is the realm of commercial video games. The best thing you can do is plant a curated seed of curiosity. Then out of game, maybe, and this is what we're doing, you can build a bridge between you and an organization that does do behavior change. They can take the baton from there, and you can go on making video games because that's what you do. If my game is wildly successful, I think about success management a lot. If I had 300,000 people come to me in the first week of release and say, I want to do soil health. How do I do that? Where do I go? Are there volunteering opportunities? I wouldn't be able to help them. I make video games. This is a Wendy's, this is a Wendy's. Like, I can't help you. Like, thank you for drinking the Kool-Aid, but that's the only thing at my show is Kool-Aid. I don't have the feast you need to go all the way to climate activist. So our strategy is partner with organizations that do that and let them take it from there. Create this content bridge, this community and content bridge all the way to that organization. You go and make the next game.
That's interesting. Yeah, just to reflect on that, I think that there is a sort of like uncomfortable middle space where you are trying to communicate or teach people something specific and that maybe doesn't work, and pulling one direction could be to say, I don't want to teach you anything. I want you to flourish. So I think a lot of what we need with people is to just open up to more dimensions of their own humanity, right? Which is sort of the extreme end of not saying anything to them and not telling them anything. They just become, they are, better able to feel their bodies and to actually connect with others, and then lots of good things probably happen. On the other hand, you could also say, I am going to make a game that expresses my perspective. It's an authorial expression, right? Disco Elysium again being an example of that, and I think that also works in some interesting ways, because then expression can lead to resonance. If you feel like this is someone's very personal experience, but it resonates with mine, but I don't feel like someone's trying to tell me something. They're talking about their experience, and they're letting me step into their experience. I think that's powerful as well. So getting out of the shallows of sort of, we're communicating something at you, to go like, no, this is my reality. This is my reality. And you get to live in my reality. And on the other hand, no, this is your reality. It's not my reality. It's your reality.
So important how you frame agency for the player. Am I giving you the wheel to define ideology in this play space? Or am I letting you taste somebody else's and ponder it? The difference between make your own character in a CRPG and then jump in the shoes of somebody else, your teachability and how open you are to the ideas presented by that work of art changes depending on how you see yourself as an agent in that experience. Do I own it? Am I planting and growing trees of my own? Or am I just kind of, looking at everybody else's and being like, I like the cut of those leaves. It really depends.
Nice.
I was oh man, I don't know why this is like mapping to like the last question that like I think we have time for one more question. But the experience of that negotiation, like that social contract and that definition of agency and what affordances we allow for each other, like I totally see that all the time whenever academics and commercial game devs interact for the first time. And there's always that tension, like, well, how much of this is your knowledge? How much of this is my lived experience? And like, how does that work?
And how much do we leave for the player?
Right, and how much of this you really want to leave open to interpretation, and like what is the risk then of like adding or diluting to the potential influence that you then have? And this is something that especially shameless plug for the climate games database for the Climate SIG is like our collection of games and game jam prototypes that touch on environmental themes, like will hopefully help us tease out like how has this negotiation occurred to date, and like what has been effective versus not, and what content hasn't been covered yet. But I wonder with this negotiation of different mental models and different ways of viewing the world, especially as you're wading further in to commercial gaming, like what advice would you give for game developers who are seeing the imagination infrastructure you are building and don't yet know how to engage with you? Like, and how do you navigate their like change aversion to like letting go of some of that creative ownership?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My tendency as someone who comes really from the world of facilitating processes for other people would be to move towards them. And so one thing is, for instance, I've offered freely, and I'm talking with Arnaud, for instance, about doing this with his team. And this is, by the way, an invitation to anyone who's listening. I've offered freely to do, within the limits of my time availability, but to do little workshops that allow people to do some structured futures work, to explore how they think about the future, to engage maybe some ideas about what's happening in the world that they haven't come across, and then to think about how their understandings of game development relate to their understandings of social change, and to basically, instead of say, well, it's this, to say, okay, do you have some time? We're going to come on a call, or we're going to come by your studio or your bedroom or whatever, and we're going to do this with you. So we're going to ask you questions, structured questions. This is how I always work. This is also how I've done work with policymakers all around the world who have, by the way, I'm now thinking about that, a similar resistance, right? They have similar, and this, instead of saying, no, do it like this, or you got to realize this, I'm asking questions, I'm giving them processes to work through their own assumptions in structured ways and their own feelings. And then they can open up themselves, I don't have to do that. They just provide the tools for that. So I would say That's of course not the easiest thing to scale, I suppose, because that requires a lot of people able to do that. But I think that's a powerful start. So working with people who are really like a surgical sort of like co-surgery on the self or something. So you help these people do surgical practice on themselves to work out where are my blockages around this stuff and how can I open myself up to to seeing more possibilities in terms of what's really possible with games is imagination infrastructure. Yeah.
I
That
don't
makes
know
sense.
why the word like a hopeful enema came to mind. I know that's not the right thing. A hopeful diuretic, a diuretic for
Oh
hope. I'm
man.
not really sure. That was not the right message to end in the last 4 minutes
It's
of this
now
live
in the
stream
history
with.
books. Yeah, it now
Yes.
exists.
Oh man.
I think that I mean it sounds like it just as a mental note for us, like it sounds like one of the potential events that we can collaborate on in the future is to have you run that workshop like with the Climate SIG community, because there's a ton of there's over 765 game developers, researchers, climate activists who care about games like now in the Discord, which is terrifying. Everybody, that's a lot of people. And a lot of potential reach for everybody. But in thinking about next steps for you and next steps for Anticiplay, it sounds like some of the opportunities to engage and amplify your efforts would be to support the crowdfunding campaign when it goes live, engage with you on these like futurism scenario planning exploration workshops. Are there any other like beginner steps that you would recommend for game developers or like-minded folks to engage with Anticiplay?
Yeah, I think yeah, indeed. We have a community, so that's important to mention, and you've been part of this, which I've really enjoyed. So thanks both for being there, and all of us here actually. That there's a community. It's called Games for Better Futures, and we have meetings, every 2 months or something like that. Depends a bit on how things go, on different topics. So the last one that Andrew mentioned was games activism and the art of destroying shit, which was about lots of games in a sustainability space. They're very nice and they're very kind, but commercial games have a lot of darkness and chaos in them, and dark playfulness, and this is really great energy to connect to activism that sees a lot of problems with the world, and that isn't afraid to take action, and we need to dismantle current systems and not just build new ones. So that was what that session was about. So we keep organizing these events, which are very informal and chill and sort of fun and explorative, and we use different methods to get people to think about change in the game sector, about what these kinds of games would look like, etc. There's a Discord there as well that people can hop onto. I do feel like it's really valuable for us to stay in very close touch with the Climate SIG and engage with so I would say join your community if they're not already part of it, and sort of get and learn about our work through that community, because that's much bigger.
Or join both.
Or join both. Exactly. Yeah, you can never have too many Discord.
I mean, have 100 Discords. Why not?
Yeah, why not? And but I think that would be just join the conversation. Would be a really great next step. One of the things that I'm really interested in doing for the project next is, I think there's lots of funding outside of the sector that is sustainability oriented funding, etc. And I want to convince these people who are throwing lots of money at sustainability to relax and let game developers do their thing more, because a lot of these serious games or games for change, they are sort of like bound by limitations of what the funders think, and you have to have certain behavioral change objectives or whatever. And I think it would be so awesome if we could liberate lots of that money that goes into far less effective projects and just give it to people to really experiment and go wild and create wildly amazing games that nobody could have expected from. And I know this world of sustainability funding reasonably well, so I would love to be an ambassador to that and help people in the Climate SIG and beyond to get access to new sources of funding as well.
I love
imagination infrastructuring. That's what it is,
funded imagination infrastructure.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, on that note, it is a top of the hour. I love that we're ending on that note because I'm sure everybody is very supportive of an expansion of the ways in which we perceive value and create content and share knowledge with each other and like amplify each other. And so with that lovely, amazing note, for everybody on the live stream, thank you so much for joining us today. For anybody who sees the recording afterwards, hope to see you live next time. But grateful for any and all of the time that Joost and Andrew and everybody has been willing to share with us. If you are interested in learning more, definitely go to IGDA Climate SIG.org. That's our community website. Anticiplay's website is linked there, and the Friends page as well. Our Discord link is in that section too. And so definitely say hi, connect, engage, participate in workshops, and let's keep going. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paula. Andrew, really great to talk. It's an amazing conversation.
Likewise.
Yay.